Avoid these land buying mistakes here on your first parcel or your second parcel, or help you realize how you maybe made a mistake on your purchase. Listen up as we break down some key mistakes that are often made or overlooked when buying land. My name is Jake Hofer. I'm the co-owner of Exodus, a real estate broker out of the state of Illinois, and we have new videos here every single Thursday and Saturday. If you're looking to learn more about buying and selling ground or anything else related in that, you're in the right location. Let's get into this conversation with Thomas Mlsna. Here we go. Looking through your site, and we just recorded a different conversation, geared a little bit differently, but this conversation, I guess, in my mind, is someone that is saving up to buy their first piece of ground, and maybe they're 4 years away from it, maybe they're 5 years away from it, or maybe it's next spring, and they're trying to figure out what are some things that they really need to be aware of as they shop for a piece of ground. Anyone that is crazy enough to make the sacrifices in their life to buy a piece of ground probably has a good basis, but I think a lot of it can be overlooked at times, or maybe they think they can overcome things that they really can't. So walking some parcels with clients, what are some things of really want to stay away from that?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious, which is probably hammered on a lot, I'm sure, the conversations you've had with other people, comes up all the time, is access.
That's the first thing I have in my notes here.
Yeah, access is going to be huge. You can get onto a piece of ground, and really any piece of ground can be improved. Even the best property always has room for improvement, and the worst properties obviously have dramatic room for improvement. So you can always improve a property, but if your access is poor, you're kind of limited there. And the big thing that I always talk about is the pressure. Keeping pressure off a property is going to be the most critical aspect to creating potential on that property. And poor access is directly related to high pressure. Every property is different. Everybody's budget's different. So if it's a small property with poor access, you put pressure on real fast. If it's a large property with poor access, you might only put pressure on part of that property, and then the rest of it, you can kind of milk out your season and maybe have more opportunities. But most people, relatively speaking, aren't going out and buying their first chunk of land and investing in a 200-300 acre property, right? No. They're looking at a 20 to 40, 60 acre property, which with my clients, I actually get really excited when someone calls me up and says they want me to walk a 25 acre property with them, because especially if you're a first time landowner, first time land buyer, I don't want to call it a practice property by any means, but it's hard to really wrap your head around the amount of work that goes into habitat improvement until you start doing it. And if you have a 25 acre property, you only have 25 acres to worry about. And most of the time out of that 25 acre property, we're only looking at really trying to improve, 50% or even 25% at a time, and try and break that down on a yearly basis. So it's not so overwhelming, but looking for a property that has good access right off the bat eliminates the biggest problem that any property has, which is the access. So access is huge.
Yeah. When you say poor access, break that down in a 101 version. Is it meaning the food, all the food's on the front part of the farm and you have to walk through? I mean, break that down of what that looks like to you on a poor access.
Food is obviously going to be a big thing, because when it comes to hunting a property, most people are hunting movement that's defined by food. So having all the food in an easy to get to area is huge. But I will say that, depending on how a property lays out, and where that food can go, that's open for interpretation. Really, you don't want to hunt a food source where deer end up at night. You want to hunt the food source or that travel corridor going to that food. So if the property lends for some manipulation, or the topography creates natural travel corridors that you can hunt where deer are moving from bed to food, and then you can get out of there without disturbing that food source, that's the kind of the gold standard. But yeah, having just food in general in a location that you can get in and out of the property without disturbing that food source is the biggest thing with access. And you can work around that. There's always a workaround in one way, shape, or form. But the last thing you want to do is invest in a property and then have someone like me show up to help you and tell you that it's going to cost you a pile of money, or you have to get a bulldozer in there, $20,000 in excavation later. Now you have an access road that doesn't disturb the whole property. Those are things that frequently come up, I think, that get overlooked, where obviously, especially again, when you're buying a new property, or first time property owner, it's exciting, right? Man, I finally saved up that money. I finally had that break in my career where I've got more cash flow or more expendable income where I can invest in a property. And it's the American dream is to have that property of your own and make those improvements. But then you get hit with that, that blindsided answer of, well, you're going to need to do these things before this really hunts well. So access is huge. Getting in and out of your property without disturbing bedding or food is huge. And then, the other thing too with access is, and especially, if it's a younger person buying a property that you potentially ever want to build on, whether it's a cabin or a house, that's a big thing when you deal with, and I've dealt with a fair share of them myself with the land and properties that we've owned, and I've flipped a few houses to get to where we are. You deal with some realtors that, at the end of the day, right, a realtor's they're a salesperson for land. Some realtors have a good idea of hunting, some don't. And even ones that have a good idea of hunting, they're going to tell you what they think you want to hear so that you buy a property. So
I haven't. Be aware. I'll tell you that though. I really
trust
haven't.
You.
I really haven't. No,
and that's the thing. It all does come back to reputation, and a lot of them, even just the listing. I'm not trying to target any specific.
It could be, yeah. I mean, there's a stigma with the business. I'll be the first to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. But every listing for vacant land is going to tell you like there's a great building site here, a great building site there. But that's the other thing you need to look at is there actually, sure, there's a great building site anywhere. But again, if you have to build a road through the whole property or beg for an easement from your neighbor to get into a spot that's worth building, that's one thing. But also, how does that building site, how does that interact with the rest of the property? Because you have a building site on the west side of the property and the prevailing wind's out of the west. And then, a big thing I think that's often overlooked with wind beyond scent is noise, right? Wind carries noise.
Yeah.
And if you get in that side of the property and, whether it is a cabin or a house, and then you're basically pushing your disturbance through the whole property with the prevailing wind, which is happening most of the time, it hurts your property. So access, not just for hunting, but anything you plan on doing, 5, 10, 20 years down the road could come back to haunt you, and then at the same time, you want to look at those neighboring properties too, because if the neighboring property has good access to the west side of your property, and then someone builds a house on that, that's just as bad as if you built a house, you're just talking one line fence difference. So
yeah.
Access is huge for sure.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So if you, two identical properties, one only has a north road access, one only has a south road access, which one of the two would you pick?
I'm probably going with the north road access. Most prevailing winds are usually south, some variant of west, but more south than west. And, obviously during hunting season, we get a lot more north winds, but those north winds rarely stick for a long period of time. It's usually a few days at a crack. And, when you look at it that way, it's kind of a flip of a coin too, right?
Sure.
Again, it really does come into how that property lays out, because if your access is from the north, but maybe your best bedding's on the north end, you have to go through that or go past that. That can be, harmful as well. And the same goes if your access is from the south and you have to cross through some of those better areas to get to food on the north side, So, it kind of is a big picture thing, and every situation is going to be different. So, sometimes you have to get creative in general with your access. If you have a property that maybe it has a river on one side, are you willing to jump in a canoe or a flat bottom boat or something to slip in there? Because that's huge. Maybe you access your property to do your food plots or scouting from one direction, but when it comes to hunting, you access from the safer area, the less obtrusive area. So every property is different and every situation is different. And the biggest piece of advice I would have there is try not to get too narrow focused or spotlighted on that property. Look at the area in general to make sure that, because that's a lot of it too, especially with a smaller property. You might have great access to get to a food plot in your property, but if you're stirring up all the neighboring properties on the way in, and those deer are coming from those neighboring properties, from my experience, deer bed where they bed based on pressure, and that pressure is often dictated, or the security that they get from those areas is dictated by the wind direction. So wind directly relates to bedding, and then pressure, kind of fine tunes that. And there's just nothing you can do. You can have phenomenal habitat, but if the wind doesn't lend for good bedding in that habitat, but the wind lends for good bedding on the other side of the fence and the habitat's mediocre, those deer are going to bed where the wind puts them. So if you have to cross through there and you blow those deer out of there and you push them into the neighbors deeper instead of into yours, that can definitely hurt you.